Well, welcome to Make the Future, Table Talk number 7.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to take me off. Let me turn off my webcam. I'm stopped.
Okay. Welcome to Make the Future, Table Talk number 7. This table talk is about common sense communications and paying attention equally to why, what, and how. Make the Future is a program that is sponsored by the USA Foundation, the Toyota Foundation, and it involves the states that you can see on the screen. The goal of the program is to help increase the, I got to start over again. I've never done this introduction before. Okay, are you able to cut this if I screw up? Once I get started in my section, I'll be fine, but I don't remember what you say in the slides.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can. I'm going to. Good morning, everyone. We are here today to talk about Make the Future, increasing the participation of females in advanced manufacturing pathways. Before we get started, I just want to give you an introduction to the project. The National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity Education Foundation has been tasked with engaging educators and recruiters in a network where they can learn and share best practices to increasing participation of females in advanced manufacturing pathways. The tools and strategies that we have developed can be used with students and parents in K-12 and community college and for outreach and to increase the participation of girls in these programs. As you know, advanced manufacturing faces a serious skills gap that could be solved by the inclusion of women and people of color, but the demographic shift in the manufacturing workforce will require a significant outreach effort with students and parents. We are working with partners. If you can go to the next slide, please. Recruiters and educators from 7 states that are engaged in this project, and we are ready to provide opportunities for all of you who are here listening to this to learn and network with each other. Our partners are selected strategically so that the participating high schools are most often also feeder schools for the AMT or Advanced Manufacturing Technician programs. We hope to enrich existing relationships and establish new ways to engage and recruit female students to these programs to build tomorrow's advanced manufacturing workforce. Next slide. We have created a suite of tools that you can access through our learning management system, as you can see here. And please contact us for access to these tools. Next slide. NAEP has scoured the research on attracting females to non-traditional and STEM careers and distilled that information into 9 key strategies. You can access information about each of these strategies, samples and suggestions of what to do and what not to do, and resources you can use with students and their families. And at this point, I am going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Dr. Lisa Riegel. Lisa, I'll let you introduce yourself, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to engage with parents. And we all talk a lot about parent engagement, but I'm going to give you some good strategies that are aligned to our 9 best practices, that the practice that is related to engaging parents and caregivers. My name is Lisa Riegel. I am the CEO of a company called Educational Partnerships Institute. We have been in business for the past 10 years. We do a lot of work with schools and governments and nonprofits on engaging stakeholders. And so this is a presentation that is focused more on the parents and really thinking about how do we help parents break down some of the stereotypes around manufacturing, and how do they help them encourage their girls to join pathways that will help them get into careers in manufacturing. So what we are going to do is first talk a little bit about why we need parents. Then we're going to turn to what should we actually be saying to the parents, and then finally, how do we reach them? So the first part is really around why, and parents play a huge role in career decisions, especially for girls and African American and Hispanic girls. And minority parents are typically less likely to be engaged in activities for a lot of factors that have nothing to do with interest. They may be unavailable to attend different kinds of events, or they may have, other kids they're schlepping around from place to place, but they're typically less likely to be going to the school events. And right now, a lot of our recruiting strategies tend to still focus on bringing people together into a room to do something. So we want to think about how do we reach those minority parents and why are they so important? We only know what we've experienced, and one of the big issues that we run into is that manufacturing today is very, very different than it was even when I grew up, and I'm not that old yet. And so when we think about what I think of as manufacturing, my view and my experience with manufacturing is very antiquated, and it's not at all accurate with today's world. So what we have to figure out is how do we help them see the opportunities that we can offer their children in manufacturing pathways when they only know what they have experienced. So it's really critical that we get to the parents, because we can get children very excited about STEM careers, about manufacturing pathways, about the AMT pathway, and then they go home and their parents are like, oh, you don't want to do that. And then all of a sudden, all of that enthusiasm dissipates. And the parents' lack of enthusiasm can be based really in a lack of understanding rather than a true understanding of this isn't a pathway that would be good for their child. We also know that parents play a huge role in career decisions when we think about Hispanic parents, especially. This woman on the screen here is a Hispanic parent. We want to think about what is the kind of variety that we want to reach, what are the logistics barriers that they take into consideration, such as childcare, work, transportation, and we want to think about how we design events and communications that we're going to be able to reach people through a variety of channels and a variety of activities and opportunities. We still have this kind of assumption around parent engagement that requires that we bring parents to an event. And unfortunately, a lot of the grant programs that fund some of the programs that are STEM-based programs ask us to count how many people we have at events. And so they sort of perpetuate this assumption that the way to engage parents is through events. And we're going to challenge that assumption a little bit today. We think about if we have a large turnout, we have a successful parent event. And then oftentimes we move to food gets people to events. So then parent engagement becomes about feasts and festivals. So we have, dinners, we have donuts with dad, we have all kinds of ways that we get parents through the door. But the problem is once we get them there, are we really achieving the goals that we have? And several of our partners in this project, as we've talked to them about their events, they don't necessarily have a hard time getting people to come to a STEM event because they're fun and they're hands-on, and kids are excited and interested in coming to do robotics or other kinds of activities. The problem is we're not necessarily being strategic where we translate that enthusiasm for an event into an actual body in a classroom. They're not actually enrolling in the programming. The other thing that we think about with parent engagement is that if a parent doesn't come, they don't care. And that is absolutely not the truth, as evidenced from the slide before about minority parents. But we want to think about how do we get parents engaged in other ways besides events. So here's an example. When I work with schools, when I work with nonprofits, we talk a lot about trying to align what we do with our problem and our goal. So for example, we want to think about, we want our parents to know about the program, know about the AMT program, and we want our parents to encourage students to enroll in the program. So then the next question becomes, what do we do to reach the right people with the right message and the right support? And the outcome we're looking for isn't attendance at the event, it's enrollment in the programming. And that's where sometimes the strategy around parent engagement can break down, is we get so focused on what we're going to do at that event and so focused on getting people to come to the event that we miss the opportunity to be really strategic about the now what, so what. So they came there, how do we track them? How do we make sure that they were engaged? How do we, figure out who was the most interested, and how do we then continue to reach out to those people? So the communication and the experiences that we provide are central to actually reaching that desired outcome and building a more recruitment strategy versus just a single event. Here's an example. When I work in schools, a lot of schools want to increase literacy. And so, we've all, if you're a parent or if you work in a school, we have spaghetti dinners. We do spaghetti dinners all the time. And I don't have a problem with spaghetti dinner. The problem is we get so tied up in the actual organization of the spaghetti dinner that we end up just being fixated on how many people attend. if our goal and our problem is a literacy problem and our activity is a spaghetti dinner, the only outcome we can say is how many people we fed. But feeding people and throwing a book cart in the back of the room isn't going to improve literacy. So as we think about parent engagement in regard to recruitment, we want to think about that activity needs to be exciting enough to get people through the door, but we also have to have on the other end, what is our long-term outcome, and how do we put in place things that will make that outcome happen. This isn't an efficient use of time, and what we end up having a lot of times is that we do all these isolated activities and we end up wearing ourselves out. We don't actually end up getting the outcome that we're hoping for, which is enrollment. So at this point, just to stop and think for just a moment, think about how you engage parents in educating students about your programming or events. And you might even want to just hit pause and make a list of the things that you do. Do you communicate with them via flyers? Do you reach out by phone calls? How do you educate them about manufacturing in the United States and not just simply reaching out to them to say, come to this STEM day or this event for your child? So if you have a moment now, just hit the pause button and make a list of what you currently do. So now that you think about what you are currently doing, think about how those are vehicles to build trust. Because as we think about working with parents, there's nothing more scary as a parent than making good decisions for your child. I have a daughter right now who's going into her senior year, and we're inundated with thinking about where should she go to college and what should she do. And as a parent, it's very scary that I might make the wrong choice with her. And so if there's an institution that can reach out and build trust with me that they're giving me is real and accurate and not just propaganda for their organization, I'm going to be more likely to feel good about the decision and to encourage my daughter to trust that organization as well. And what's nice about trust is that it's actually a formula. There are 5 components to trust. There's whether or not you're benevolent, reliable, competent, honest, and open. So as you think about the ways that you engage parents that you just brainstormed, ask yourself, if you were the parent and the receiver of that information or those experiences, do they believe that you have what's best for their child in mind? Are you reliable as far as what you say is what you do? Do your events run smoothly? Are your communications consistent? Do you appear competent? Are you telling them things that they don't know in a way that sounds like it's research-based and not just advertising slogans? Are you honest when they bring up concerns rather than just dismissing those concerns? Are you honest and open about the pros and cons and good and bad of the various options for their child? And then when we think about communication, the communication is really that vehicle that builds trust. And we don't have the opportunity a lot of times to meet people face to face. And so we don't have the chance to build that trust with them in person. And so we have to think about, as we communicate, are we sending messages in a way where we are the action or reaction that we want? And the answer is most of the time no. So my company does a lot of work with departments of education and large organizations that have a lot of information that they need to send to people. And generally what they currently do is what we call the egocentric communication process. And that's basically a process where we start with the sender. We say, I have all this information I need to share. I'm going to organize the information in a way that makes sense to me if I were the receiver. I'm going to explain information, oftentimes in very jargon-heavy wording. I may or may not be thinking about the information through the lens of what the sender, or what the receiver would feel is most important. And then I'm going to hope that the action happens. And we get a lot of, when you think about government or state communications, you get a lot of communication that begins with, like, according to federal regulation, whatever, we are required to inform you. That's definitely an egocentric communication process. That first sentence tells me you are communicating with me because you have to, not because it's good for me. So what we want to think about instead is to flip this around and really make it strategic. We want to first say, what is the action or reaction that I want? So maybe you want them to attend an event. Maybe you want them to start to dispel some of the myths that they have around manufacturing. Maybe you want them to come and enroll their child in your program. But being very specific about what do I actually want to happen because of this communication. Then think about who needs to do that action or have that reaction, because it's not the person, a lot of times you've heard the phrase sing into the choir. A lot of communications, we're singing to the choir. So people who are already convinced that manufacturing is a great pathway are going to say, yes, yes, this is great, this is great. But if we don't hit head on the stereotypes and concerns of the people we actually need to reach, then we miss the opportunity to really educate them by getting their attention. So then the third piece then becomes, okay, now that I'm thinking of what I want to happen and who I need to do it, then I need to ask myself, what's the message or channel that would influence those people to do the intended action? So we might like email, we might like, face-to-face events, but that may not be the channel that would influence all the different various groups of caregivers and parents. So we need to be thoughtful about how do we reach the people that we need to actually communicate with. And here's the problem that we run into in today's world is we are so information heavy. The average number of advertisement and brand exposures in this country today is 5,000. We get 5,000 different exposures to people trying to get our attention. And when you go through those numbers and you get to the red box, you see only 12 of those actually make an impression or engage us. We only are even aware of 86 out of 5,000 ads that we start to have coming at us every single day. So if you want to be that 12, you want to be in the 12 ads or the 12 pieces of information that actually engage me, we have to be really strategic and thoughtful about how to do that. When we work with organizations on engaging parents, we have something that we call the wheel of positivity. And really it's simple. I think a lot of times we make very complicated things simple, and we make very simple things complicated. When this wheel of positivity, if you look on the outside, it's really just human behaviorism. So I'm motivated to do something, I do something that I find meaningful, and then I get feedback, and that determines whether I remain motivated to do it. And so if we can control that, if we can think, okay, how do we motivate people to either explore information or to come to an event, then we say, okay, we get them to the event. Is the event itself, is the performance useful? And if it's not useful and valuable to the people who are there, then they aren't going to come back. They're not going to remain engaged. And then finally, and this is the piece that I think we miss a lot, is the feedback part. So we've motivated somebody, we've brought them to an event that they've enjoyed, but then there's really no feedback after that to help keep them motivated. And so if we can harness the outside of that wheel, we have a much better chance of getting parents not just to be informed or to come to a single event, but to really engage in the career planning for their children. So then inside the wheel are the cogs that really help to move the wheel forward. And the largest cog is partnerships, and really thinking about, what is it that you bring to the partnership and what is it that the parent brings? And so as you're thinking about the purpose of the partnership being helping put kids in educational pathways that will put them in careers in manufacturing, what is your role and what is the parent's role? And really defining that. And then thinking about the communication and how do we communicate with the parents in a way that we're attending to their needs and we're actually getting their attention. And then the third cog is that support cog. Do we think about the barriers that parents have to overcome in order to become engaged? We're all very busy today. The one thing I can tell you, everywhere I go, every single person I meet is like, oh, I'm so busy. And we are busy. So we have to figure out how do we support people so that we don't continually have our needs put on the back burner. So the key questions when we think about developing a wheel of positivity is really asking yourself first, what do you want parents to do? Does it involve your enrollment? Do you want them to come to your events? Do you want them to understand your programs? Do you want them to change their opinions of manufacturing in the United States? What is it that you really want them to do? And that question is a lot harder to answer than you would think. A lot of times when you think about what you want parents to do, people will say, well, we just want them to support our program, or we want them to support options for their child in these educational pathways. But what does that actually look like? If I put on a cheerleading uniform and sing your fight song, am I supporting you? I don't know what you want me to do. And if we're not clear about what we want people to do, we never get to that action step. People don't know, well, what do you want from me? The next thing is really saying, who are the parents you need to do it? What do they value? we are value-driven people. And so if we don't figure out what are the values of the parents, then we miss opportunities to show them how what we're asking of them is congruent with their values. And then the next question is, how do we influence parents to do what we want them to do? And that involves really understanding the people that you're serving and understanding the barriers that we need to overcome in order to make things easy. And then finally thinking, how do we know we were successful? This is another area where I think a lot of programs miss a chance to really increase the impact of what they do as far as their recruiting strategy and their parent engagement, because we don't collect data to help us gauge our success. So at the end of an event, other than maybe some type of quick, did you have fun today? Did this help you think about a STEM career? Do you collect any data from the parents? Do you collect data that helps you better understand who they are and what they value so that you can improve the messaging and the experience that you give them? And do you also gather that data that can help you gauge your success to your overall outcome, which really has to do with enrollment? So the first thing is really, what's your message? What do we want parents to know and do? And we've talked about this already, coming to events, being informed, overcoming the stereotypes, exploring options for their kids. So for each of those bullet points, what I would recommend is actually writing out. So when we say we want them to be informed of what, what are the talking points? What are the key facts? If you could teach everybody 5 things, what would they be? Thinking about the stereotypes and being very honest about what are the stereotypes in various communities. And depending on the communities and the role that manufacturing has played in those communities, stereotypes are going to differ. And so thinking, what really are the stereotypes of the various groups of students that you're trying to attract, and how do we really head on think of messaging that can help to overcome those stereotypes. And in the 9 best practices that we have for you through this program, there's quite a bit of information that can help you think about that. It can help you think about, especially, the micro messaging and the way that we think about career development for girls and the messaging we send them and the stereotypes of who fits in these kinds of classes or in these industries. It can be a really important thing to just be very honest and to lay out what those stereotypes are and how you're going to overcome them. So again, I would ask you to stop and think for just a minute. You might pause this recording, and now you've thought about what the key ways are that you engage parents. Take a minute now to really list out what are the key messages that you use with parents. Do you have well thought out talking points that you use consistently over time? We don't remember things the first time we hear them, so we need to think about consistency in the messaging that we use over a longer period of time. So take a moment now, hit pause, and maybe list out some of those key messages that you use with parents at this point. So when we think about the messaging, so now we've thought about, how you engage them in the messaging. What we want to think about again is first really that clarity and understanding. What do I want to happen, by whom, and then what message or channel will influence them? So we've talked a little bit about this first part of what do you want parents to do. The next one is really to think about, before we start creating any kind of messaging for parents, who are the parents you need to do it and what do they value? So we want to think about the barriers that you can predict. Do you know the parents that you're serving, the caregivers? And just as a side note, I say parents because saying parents or caregivers every time just becomes worrying or wordy. But we all know that it's not just parents. It can be grandparents, it can be caregivers, it can be foster parents, it can be, my friend's parents, whoever the people are who are the stakeholders who influence a child's decision is who I'm referring to when I say parents. What we want to think about is what we know about parents in general. So there was a study from the Fordham Institute that looked at, from education in general, this isn't just for manufacturing pathways, but just in general, as parents think about what they want for their children, there were some non-negotiables that came up. They want strong curriculum in core subject areas in schools. They want an emphasis on STEM. So knowing that those are non-negotiables for parents pretty much across the board, think back to your messaging. Are you really promoting the strong curriculum in the core subject areas, and are you emphasizing how this fits into STEM? And also, by the way, really defining what STEM is, because We hear the word a lot, but most parents who aren't in education don't really know what STEM is either. They also had a list of must-haves that they discovered. The first was learning good study habits and self-discipline. Secondly was developing critical thinking and life skills. And the third was verbal and written communication skills. So as you think about how you recruit students into your program, ask yourself, are you really pushing these aspects of the program? Are you pushing the career tech student organizations? Are you pushing the parts of the curriculum in the AMT program that really talk about critical thinking and life skills and the communication skills? Because those are a key piece of the curriculum, but they oftentimes are shadowed by the discussions around the work skills and the technical skills. And the expendable aspects of the education for parents was the idea of proximity, of the facilities, which is kind of interesting because a lot of schools I work with are very focused on their facilities. And that was something that most parents said, look, if the facilities aren't great, that's fine as long as the non-negotiables and must-haves are present. They were also less concerned with children having a love of fluency on a foreign language, which was kind of interesting, and a small school enrollment. They also went through and found that there were different kinds of parents. And so I'm going to go, this just is an overview of how the parents break down. But I'm going to go through each of these a little to help you understand the complexity when you start to really think of who is it that we need to reach. You know, the parents are not just lumped into one group. There's some that are pragmatists. This is about 36% of the parents in the United States, and they are all about pathways. They expect kids to graduate. They want a 2-year degree. They're fine with vocational and job-related programs. You'll notice that these are disproportionately a higher percentage of parents that have boys and from lower income households. So that's something to think about as a challenge. You know, the parents who are going to be open to listening to manufacturing pathway programs for their kids tend to be parents of boys. There are not as many parents from girls. So we have to overcome that to bring more of the other types of parents with girls into the discussion. They also tend to be less strong academically. They may have more IEPs or 504 plans. This perhaps could be a leftover from the idea that schools have tended to talk about the college track as the track for the strong academic kids, a vocational track for kids who are less strong academically. So this could be sort of a historical stereotype that you need to think about overcoming. And then you can see the other ones there. The Jeffersonians are about almost 20%, about 1 in 5. These are folks that are very interested in the traditional approach to learning. They focus a lot on test prep. And so when you start to think about your trying to reach this 20% of the population, you want to think about citizenship, democracy, leadership, character development, the other pieces of the curriculum besides the technical skills that kids develop during, or I should say students develop during the educational pathway, because that's the message that's going to get their attention. Test score hawks are folks that are looking for high test scores and programming for gifted students. They are not as interested in the social skills piece. They are really about achievement. They tend to be younger parents, and they tend to be African American and Hispanic parents, which is interesting because as we try to build equity in these manufacturing pathways, we are going to struggle in this group of parents because they're not as much interested in the vocational programs. We're going to have to show them how those vocational programs are actually about achievement and that we can move kids into higher levels of achievement in their career pathway by engaging in these programs. The multicultural group is about 22%. These are parents that are very interested in emphasizing how to work with people from diverse backgrounds. And this is, again, something that's going to be a little concerning in manufacturing, which is basically dominated by white men. So if we want to think about sending messages about how important it is to create more diversity in the workforce, really focused on any diversity you have in your program, thinking about focusing on diversity of your business partners and putting out their role models that are diverse types of people to help talk about the opportunities in manufacturing and the AMT programming and how that can lead students to good careers in manufacturing. These folks tend to be more likely to be African American and tend to live in urban areas. And so as we start to, again, think of our target population, especially in regard to equity, and this program, Make the Future, is really around girls and African American girls. This is something we want to think about our messaging. The expressionists are pretty well-rounded. These are people who rank music and arts highly, but they want lots of extracurriculars beyond sports. So as you think about, when you choose to have your child go into a career center, my daughter is in a digital design program at a career center, and that was a real concern for us, was thinking, is she going to lose out on the well-rounded kinds of extracurriculars and activities that she could have in a traditional school? And so, we were very attracted to the opportunities for her in student leadership, in the career tech organization, in the internship opportunities, thinking about the communication and critical thinking she was going to learn. So you can kind of see that you can create a bank of messages, but then depending on the kinds of parents that you're working with and what they value, you can start to tailor which messages come out at the top and which ones aren't quite as important. And this is the group that is more likely to be parents of girls. And so as you're thinking about attracting girls, you really want to focus on the well-rounded pieces of the program. I think a lot of kids think about career pathways as a pipeline, as a pathway where once you get on it, you can't get off. Instead, we want to think about how this is opening up a whole series of opportunities for students to develop their skills in a variety of ways versus just, we're going to teach you a credential. And then the last group is the strivers. These are the college prep. These parents are, again, more likely to be African American and Hispanic. They are all about building resume for college applications. So these are parents who are going to be interested in hearing about stackable credentials. They're going to be interested in hearing about college credit that their students can earn if they're in a high school program leading into an AMT program. They're going to be interested in how the AMT program fits into a larger pipeline that goes on into college. So going to top tier colleges is very important for these parents. So keeping that in mind, of the idea that this isn't a second tier opportunity, it's an opportunity that can build in a variety of directions and can make kids more competitive to get into higher level engineering programs or other kinds of top tier colleges. The other thing we work with a lot in this country is refugee and immigrant populations. And something to consider here is the level of stress that refugee immigrant populations need to overcome. And so as we think about the trauma and acculturating into the US, resettling, they feel isolated a lot of times. We want to think about how we can design, again, building that trust. Are we open? Are we honest? Are we benevolent? And I often say to folks, if you moved to, the Czech Republic tomorrow, would you know what the expectations are for a parent in an educational setting? Would you know just from their culture what would make sense as far as being engaged or being involved? The definition for being involved and engaged is different in different cultures. And so it goes back to what I was saying before about understanding, what do I want parents to do? When you're working with refugee populations, you need to make sure that you're explicit about that, because from their culture, they may have had a completely different experience of what the role of a parent is in their child's career development or educational development. Another thing we run into is generations, and I want to do a quick kind of explanation to help you think about generations and parents, because as I said earlier, it's not really just parents, it's grandparents, it's great aunts, it's all kinds of people who are raising kids. So I always like to, since we're generally educators that would be watching this, I can explain this very easily through the education policy and how the generation has impacted education in the way that we have set policy. When we look at the traditionalists grew up, and as a small caveat here, just because we're born in a certain generation doesn't necessarily mean that we are a cookie cutter of that generation. But generation work is interesting because the social, political, historical context in which we grow up does impact what we value and how we live our lives. And so understanding sort of how the culture is impacted by just that generation and how it impacts their actions and their values can help us do a better job of connecting, again, what we want people to do with the people we're asking to do that action. So traditionalists grew up during, the Great War. They were all about duty and honor and civil service. They were a generation that believed that you earned your spot and you went up in rank in a sequential way. You can see this kind of generational value show up in education policy because that's when we started the Carnegie unit. We had tracking, we had grade levels and divided subject areas, and we put everything in a box and everybody followed through the same exact pathway. We had perennial style classrooms in rows. Everybody was given the same instruction at the same time, and you sort of march together like a platoon. When we get into the next generation really grew up during that Vietnam era, and that era was a very different era where all of a sudden society was struggling against the powers, and they started to organize. And so we had groups of people that, they could fight against things that they didn't think were fair, that it was about civil engagement, it was about coming together and being cooperative. And so as you saw those people get into educational power, we started to see service learning, humanities, we looked at cooperative learning and group learning. There were times when they did break down the walls and we had multi-level classrooms again, because that was the value, was if we bring kids together and they work together, that we will create a citizenry that's going to be more educated and active. Then that group of parents, unfortunately, was one of the groups of parents in our history that got divorced at a higher rate than anybody else. So the Generation X generation, which is my generation, we were the first latchkey kid generation. And so we came home and didn't necessarily have parents at home to take care of us because we had a lot more dual family incomes, and we also had a lot of divorced parents. And so we raised ourselves in many ways. And so that Gen X group of people are not interested in getting together and having meetings and collaborating. They're like, tell me what you want and get out of my way and let me do it my way. And so you start to see the Gen Xers in the workforce. We start to see more remote work. We see in education, we see computer-aided instruction, a standards-based movement where we say, hey, don't tell me how to get there, just tell me what the standards are and then give me options. I want to be on the computer. I'll do this on my own. I don't need to sit in a classroom. So you start to see how that Generation X started to impact the way that we do school. And then finally, we have millennials. And millennials have been a generation that have been very micromanaged. I remember when I first had my daughter and we went to a play date and I didn't realize I wasn't allowed to leave. I had to sit and watch kids play. When we were growing up, in my generation, you played outside with very little supervision. We have a lot of supervision today. And so the millennial generation has always been in hyper-organized activities that are organized by somebody else. They have had constant feedback. If they have a conflict, they come to the parents help resolve them, teachers help resolve it. So now they're starting to get to that age where they're in the workforce. And what we're seeing is they're very creative and collaborative and cooperative because they've done so many, group set up activities all the way from, really formal birthday parties to having soccer teams when they're 4 years old and very organized activities. So they work really well together as a group and they can be creative, but they need a lot of feedback. And so now we're seeing this big movement on formative feedback and progress monitoring assessment so that we're always giving feedback so that everybody knows exactly what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. So what this means for you is as you think about recruiting, you start to think about the values of those generations and the values of what they believed education should look like. When you start to introduce a model like AMT, it's a different model of education. And so you're going to get different objections and support from various generations. So we want to go back and say, the messaging that you're giving, are you messaging your program for you, for your generation, for your values, for your, going back to the different kinds of parents, or do you have enough variety in those messages to be able to tailor them to whatever the intended audience is? So again, if you want to take a moment here and pause, go back to your list of messages, go back to the events and the communications that you have with parents and start to ask yourself, are we missing opportunities to engage various types of parents, various values within our stakeholders, or various generations of parents? Okay, so now that we've had thought to think about what we want parents to do and who are the parents that we need to do it. Now we want to think about how do we actually influence behavior change, because behavior change is hard. And if we just tell somebody once, you should do this or this is good for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to go out and do it. I think all of us know we should move more, we should eat better. And so we think about, why aren't we all healthy then? And the reality is because we're not influenced to do the behavior change. And I always like to use weight loss because everybody's had the New Year's resolution that lasts like 3 weeks, and then we fall back into bad habits. So when we start to think about breaking down generational stereotypes around manufacturing, around educational pathways, we have to really think about, the messaging is the personal. This is what you should know, what you should believe. But do we also create experiences that are social and structural? So for example, if I wanted to become more healthy, I have messaging that tells me what I should eat or how I should work out. I know that, and I might go to the gym and I might start to work out. But I'm more apt to go to the gym and continue to live a healthier life if my friend is doing the diet plan with me, or if I have I have somebody to come and pick me up in the morning, and now all of a sudden it's not just about me. We're social creatures, and changing that behavior is hard. When I work with parents, oftentimes I will set up parent buddies, and if we commit to doing something new as far as engaging our kids or supporting their education, I will have the parents commit to something that they agree to do, and then they follow up with each other. So they kind of hold each other accountable. And parents have said that that's been a really valuable step, because just when they start to slip back into old habits, they get a phone call from a friend that says, hey, how's it going? Have you tried the new things that Dr. Regal talked to you about? The third is really that structural piece. That gets into the barriers. I'm not going to go to the gym if the gym is 10 miles away and it's raining. If it's right down the street or it's in my basement, I really have fewer excuses not to do that. So as we start to think about the structural barriers that parents face, and going back to what do we want them to do? We want them to believe something different. We want them to enroll their children. What are the structural barriers? Is FAFSA a structural barrier? How do we actually break that barrier down? Is coming to a physical event just to learn about the event a barrier? How do we break that down? So we want to think about, we're asking people to change beliefs and behaviors, and it's a lot more difficult than putting together a flyer and a fun day event where the kids can come and build some robots or play on some machinery. It needs to be part of a much more strategic, long-term kind of approach. Here's an example of how you can think about influencing. And this is from a book called Influencers. That's a really powerful book if you ever have a chance to take a look at it. When we look at those three levels, so there's the personal level, the social level, and the structural level, we want to think about how do we design our recruitment communication effort through the lens of expectancy and value, because expectancy and value is the motivation equation. Motivation is I expect to do well and I value what I'm doing. I value gardens. I think they're beautiful. I kill every plant I've ever planted. So my expectancy and my lived experience is very low. So my motivation to really build a garden that I would really like is non-existent because I don't believe I can do it. So that's an example of how motivation is impacted by, can I do this and do I value it? So when you're thinking about it on a personal level, you want to think, do parents think they can do what you're asking them to do? And then have you created messages that they would find motivating? On a social level, we want to think about, can we help parents support each other? And then on the value side, do you celebrate and publicize when other parents do the behavior? If you have parents that you bring to an event and they're really involved with their students, at the end, do you give them some type of kudos, some type of celebration to publicize for other parents? This is what we want you to do and we're going to celebrate it. And then finally, the structural piece, do you scaffold learning for parents so that if they don't know what you're asking of them, especially thinking about enrollment, thinking about paperwork, thinking about how do I even, how does this whole program work, just the nuts and bolts? Do you scaffold the learning for parents? And do you make it easy and convenient? I work with a lot of organizations that say, well, it's all available on our website. Nobody goes to a website anymore, so it's not convenient or easy. Finally, we want to know, how do we know we're successful? And that is whether or not they're enrolling. And sorry, somebody just came to my door. So I want you to think about, what are the aha moments that you have? What's next for you? And how can we help you as you start to think about improving your recruitment strategies? And so at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Kathleen. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Are you still there, Kathy? There you are.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I will let you close the day and let them know about next steps.
Okay. I'm going to pause this recording. Well, thank you, Lisa, for a very informative presentation. And thank you all for listening today. We assume that since you are watching this, you are somewhat familiar with the Make the Future project, but if you are not, you are welcome to contact either one of us for more information. In addition to Lisa's job with the Educational Partnership Institute, she is also the project manager for the Make the Future project with NAEP. And we really appreciate the work that she's doing with us. And we look forward to engaging with you all in the future. And again, for any questions or to get more involved, please contact either one of us. Have a great day. Thanks.